Hello from OG Benchmarks. This video is all about some lessons I have learned about how CPU and GPU bottlenecks affect gaming performance. On this screen is kind of my worldview on CPU and GPU bottlenecks. This view is based on watching countless hours of YouTube tech content. My view goes something like this graph. At high graphics settings, over on the left, the GPU will be cranking with high usage and low frame rates. The GPU will be taking it relatively easy. As graphic settings are reduced and frame rates increase, the CPU will need to work harder to prepare data for a rising number of frames. Eventually, both the GPU and CPU will be maxed out. As graphics quality continues to drop, the GPU can take a breather, as the CPU is now pegged at 100%. This is a simple representation, but under this viewpoint, either the CPU or GPU or possibly both will be under 100% load no matter what the graphical settings are. YouTube creators definitely discuss bottlenecks, but they rarely walk through this trade-off by showing data. Since I now have some building experience, I thought I would run some tests and see how this view on bottlenecks holds up against real gaming data. So here is the plan. I plan to build a test system. I'll do some simple benchmarking to make sure everything works okay. I'll then install MSI Afterburner so I can monitor performance in real time. I'll then see what happens when playing Dota 2 and Fortnite. I'll be honest here, I'm not much of a gamer, so I did pick a couple free-to-play games. Okay, let's see the test build. This little honey is my test build, aka Fire and Ice. This is strictly a bunch of old hardware. I'd be embarrassed to remove the side panel and show my lack of cable management. This computer is definitely a worker and not a looker. The motherboard is from an old Gateway computer. It has an LGA 1156 socket. The CPU is one of Intel's first i7 CPUs. It has 4 cores and 8 threads, and it's at the top of the LGA 1156 stack for Intel. The cooler is a Regentech Rhea. I'll talk more about it in a moment. The system has 16 gigabytes of DDR3 1333 RAM. The GPU is a Quadro K2200. This card is very comparable to a GTX 750 Ti, except this card has 4 gigs of VRAM. Most 750 Ti's only have 2 gigs. Then there are the other parts, an SSD, an Aries Game PSU, please don't laugh too hard, and a handsome Rosewell Ranger M case. I got this case off Newegg for $25 last year, and I think Newegg was clearing out all its old stock. You can't find them anymore, but then again, nobody probably cares. The system has the Core i7 880 matched with the Quadro K2200. I picked this combo for 2 reasons. 1, I had the parts on hand. 2, from what I could gather online, this pairing is pretty well balanced. If I manage my graphics settings well, I should be able to tip this system between a GPU bottleneck and a CPU bottleneck. That's the theory anyway. This is a picture of the startup screen for the Gateway motherboard. I love it. When I was in high school, Gateway was just getting started and making quite a splash by selling computers directly to customers. Gateway started in 1985, just after Dell, and gave Dell a run for its money during much of the 1990s, especially in the consumer arena. I benchmarked the CPU with Cinebench. My main concern was thermal throttling. I first tried an Intel stock cooler. That wasn't nearly enough cooling for this 95-watt CPU, even higher under turbo. The CPU temps were deep into the 80s, and Tmax is only like 73 for this CPU. I then switched to a Regentech Rhea. I had never heard of it, but it's one of the few tower coolers with a low enough profile to fit into my small Rosewell case. I got the cooler for almost nothing. In fact, I bought 2. While the tower cooler was better in terms of temperatures, and the core clocks were sometimes hitting their peak, the CPU was not locking into full turbo clocks like these older CPUs can. I put 2 fans on the cooler thinking I'd be set, but the temperature difference was negligible. With 2 fans, the CPU did spend more time at 3.3 gigahertz, but the core clock still had dips to the base clock speed. While the CPU is technically still throttling, I can't fit a bigger tower cooler into the case, and I don't want to shell out for a higher performance cooler. So I'll leave the system as is. Note that the multi-core score hasn't changed appreciably even with the much lower temperatures. I'm still getting roughly everything from this CPU. This little cooler exercise did teach me one thing. I've often wondered why more tower coolers don't include dual fans. Now I know that a second fan doesn't do much unless you have a second fin stack. I benchmarked the GPU with heaven. There isn't much special to see here. At 1080p, decreasing the graphics settings boosts the frame rate. I did not carefully track the GPU temps, but they were low, like 70 to 75 degrees. Okay, everything seems fine. Let's now look at some gaming benchmarks. Here are some numbers from Dota 2. So Dota has presets for graphics settings. 4 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. At highest quality and at 1080p, Dota did max out my GPU. The frame rate was fine at 73. My old test system can gain at least a little bit. Dropping the settings from down to 3, 2, 1 did exactly what I expected to the GPU. GPU usage dropped steadily. Note that CPU usage, the blue bar, did not budge in a meaningful way. I certainly never bottlenecked the CPU. My view of CPU and GPU bottlenecks doesn't fit these data. Regardless, I was pretty excited about these numbers. The game looked great and ran smoothly. Full disclosure, this is not real gameplay. I just kept reloading one of the tutorials, the one with the hero who rides the wolf, and monitored frame rates. The FPS for real gameplay might be different with correspondingly different CPU and GPU usages. I will point out the RAM usage. Even old Dota used up to 6 gigabytes of system RAM. I hear people say that you really need 16 gigabytes of RAM for any gaming, and I can see that 8 gigabytes might be pushing it, even with an older game. Note that I ran Dota with just the game and Afterburner running. Nothing else was open. Video RAM usage, however, was much more modest. You certainly can play Dota with a 2 gigabyte GPU, and maybe a 1 gigabyte card is fine if you're willing to play at 900 or 720p. So that's Dota. Let's now look at Fortnite. Here are the Fortnite numbers, again at 1080p. Like Dota, Fortnite has 4 preset graphic levels. Note that at the highest settings, Dota had an FPS of 73. In Fortnite, I get just 19. Fortnite is a much more demanding game. While the GPU does not hit 100%, it's at about 90% at the highest settings, and GPU usage creeps down to about 80% at the lowest settings. The CPU starts at just maybe 25%. It rises more than with Dota and finishes at 61%. Based on these data, if I could continue to lower and lower settings, maybe these trends would cross and show a CPU bottleneck. I did try some benchmarking at 900 and 720p, but I could not get the CPU to run above this value of 61%. Unlike the Dota numbers, these were all taken from real gameplay in solo matches. I was surprised at the system RAM numbers. Just over 8 gigabytes of RAM. I'm glad I put 16 gigs into this build. The VRAM usage is also showing that 4 gigabytes of VRAM is likely a necessity at 1080p, even for esport gaming. Okay, while I didn't get a CPU bottleneck, at least I pushed the i7 880 to 61%. At this point, I thought I would cheat a little bit and put in a weaker CPU with the Quadro GPU. So it's back to Cinebench. My new CPU is an i3 530. It still fits the LGA 1156 socket, but it is a Westmere CPU. Nehalem had the i7 and the 4-core 4-thread i5s. Westmere had the Celerons, Pentiums, i3s, and 2-core 4-thread i5s. This 73-watt CPU ran cool at 49 degrees in Cinebench. The score is way lower than the i7, so this i3 should give a chance to see a bottleneck CPU. The i3 does not have a turbo, so the max clock speed is fixed at 2.93 gigahertz. Here is Heaven with scores for both the new and old system. The only difference is the CPU. People say that Heaven is strictly a GPU benchmark, and that's pretty much what I see here. The blue bars are for the i7, and the reddish bars are the i3. The GPU pretty much performs the same for both CPUs. So I guess Heaven really is a GPU-only test. Alright, everything seems to be in order. Let's see how Fortnite did with this system. Can we get a CPU bottleneck? Here are the results. First thing, note that I tested more settings than the default 4. There is a low setting, but you can drop the resolution a bit more to go to a true minimum. What do we see? At epic settings, the GPU is just about maxed out, and the CPU is already approaching 60%. The i7 was at less than 30% at epic settings. As the quality drops, the GPU usage also drops, and the CPU quickly plateaus around 80%. At the very lowest possible settings, the GPU was down to 35% and the CPU got to 83%. Alright, well, this looks a bit more like I expected. GPU starts high and tapers off, and the CPU starts low-ish and rises up. The CPU doesn't rise all the way to 100%, but it definitely plateaus at a high value. Okay, let's go revisit my old view of bottlenecks. With both systems, I was able to see around 100% usage on the GPU, but not the CPU. What gives? Well, this chart only measures GPU and CPU usage based on core clock speed. Other relevant factors could be RAM speed or memory bandwidth. Let's look at a different chart. Here is a chart that shows a third effect, vaguely labeled as memory. In this scenario, the GPU is the bottleneck at high settings. As quality drops, the CPU RAM usage could rise and become the bottleneck before the CPU usage is maximized. This scenario is purely hypothetical, but it's not hard to imagine that some other process, perhaps memory related, could be a bottleneck as opposed to core clocks for the GPU or CPU. Very recently, I saw a video that mentioned that games can exceed VRAM. In that case, the game uses system RAM, which tends to be much slower and can create a data transfer bottleneck. So while a bottleneck is often related to the core clocks of the GPU or CPU, the real issue may be something else. I hope you found this discussion helpful. If you don't already, I would encourage you to tweak video settings on your own system and monitor the results with something like Afterburner. As always, please like, subscribe, or leave a comment or question. Take care.